Okay, well, I'm going to kick it off, and we know that folks will kind of keep joining us over the next few minutes, but at least this gives us the opportunity to start on time. My name is Lindy Johnson. I'm very fortunate to get to know most of you. I am the Vice President of the East Bay Leadership Council, and I staff this task force, which I very much enjoy doing. Most of the time, these meetings are kicked off by our friend Gary Darling, who is a co-chair of this task force and one of the members of the planning team. He was unable to be here today, so I get to do the honors. This is a legislative update. We try to do this once a year, usually in March, April, or May. It's a great opportunity for us to get to hear from experts who are both working on bills, but are also just kind of experts in the field and area through which they are consultants. So we're really excited to have Katharine here today with us as she's going to kick us off. Before we do that, we usually talk about East Bay Leadership Council updates. We are holding some events over the next few weeks. We have a Capital Series event planned for the end of May. There's potentially going to be a slight change to that, so look out for some information about that. And then we are in the midst of planning a reception with Sue Nowak. She's a Pleasant Hill City Council member who was just recently appointed to MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So we're going to have a reception so that folks can get to know her and talk a little bit about her new role with MTC and ABAG. So if any of that interests you, let me know. Otherwise, pay close attention to our newsletters. All the information will be coming out there. This is the part of the meeting where we usually turn over to Dan McIntyre, who is also a co-chair on the Water, Energy, and Environment Task Force, to talk about upcoming meetings, get you all excited about what we're going to be talking about over the next few months. Unfortunately, Dan also couldn't meet with us today. It is in the midst of budget discussions right now, so he was unable to join. So I am also going to do that part of the meeting. Over the next few months, we are going to be talking about radar systems and a new radar system that is going to help with predicting extreme weather events. We're going to be talking about recycled water, kind of a full statewide overview of that. Look out for that in early summer. And then I think as we kind of get further into the year, we'll have a handful of different topics that have kind of been proposed, but we're still in the process of deciding exactly how they're going to be laid out. So kind of looking forward to that. If you ever have ideas or things that you'd like to see us talk about, please let us know. One of the things we have on the pipeline is a discussion about the Antioch desalinization project and looking at kind of how that was achieved and what it will achieve. And there's also some conversations about talking about hydrogen, particularly as energy has become part of this task force's work. We want to make sure that we highlight some of the great things being done in those spaces. So again, if you're interested in being part of the planning team, let me know. We'd be happy to have you. Or if you just have a topic suggestion, we're always excited to have those. I did want to just recognize that Gary is here. Hi, Gary. He's part of our planning team. And then Audrey London is also here. Thank you, Audrey. They are also part of the planning teams. And we have about a 10-member group that comes together quarterly to talk about potential topics. And it's always fun to kind of get everyone's input. And hey, EBLC buys the beer. So if I haven't enticed you, I hope that I do. With that,
hi, Lindy.
Hi.
I'm here too.
Hi, George. Sorry, George. Oh, you know
okay.
what? I said Gary and I meant to say George. I'm so sorry. I think I saw the G and that's where my brain went.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks. George is part of our planning team. He's a co-chair as well.
And Don is here too. It looks like. Yeah.
Hi, Don.
Anyway.
Yes, as I mentioned, there's about 10 of us, so we're a good sized little group. Okay, so I will just sort of stop for one moment and just see if there's any questions or anything anyone wanted to chime in on before I jump into an introduction of Katharine Moore, who was our first speaker this morning. All right, I'm not hearing any, so let me introduce Katharine. Katharine Moore is a chief consultant to the California Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, which I imagine is a mouthful to say. She initially joined the Natural Resources and Water Committee in 2009 as a Science and Technology Fellow and became a consultant to the committee in 2012. So in case there's ever any doubt about the incredible expertise and knowledge of the folks who do the consultant and committee work, I think Katharine is really a testament to the incredible knowledge that these folks bring to the work. She holds a PhD in atmospheric science and an MS and BS degree in engineering from UC Berkeley and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, respectively. So she comes with a lot of knowledge and it seems like a great dedication to public service. So thank you for being here, Katharine. We're really excited to hear about some of the bills that are making their way to your committee this year and your thoughts.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and certainly thank you for the very generous introduction. I appreciate it very much. You know, just to start off, and I'm sure you've heard this before, if the legislative updates are a regular part of your meetings, and that is, of course, I am legislative staff. What I'm going to say is my opinion, doesn't reflect the opinion of the committee or the chair or any members of the committee or even any members of the legislature. So that's always important to keep in mind. Most of the decisions obviously are way above my pay grade. I did just want to talk a tiny bit about the jurisdiction of our committee. So we have jurisdiction over almost all of the departments, boards, conservancies, commissions within the California Natural Resources Agency, and of course, the Natural Resources Agency itself. So that would be state parks, Department of Water Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife, the State Coastal Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Board, and things like that. Our jurisdiction is not the same as Assembly Natural Resources Committee. Their efforts include a lot of air and water quality, which is not part of our jurisdiction. So I am really not going to talk about air and water quality very much at all, although certainly with respect to climate, I'll talk a little bit about some of what's going on there. I was asked to talk about some of the legislation, as Lindy mentioned, and also where our committee is going to go with respect to, in particular, oversight. So I'll talk about the legislation first. We'll talk a little bit about oversight at the end. Certainly, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand on Zoom. I don't really mind being stopped or interrupted. I'm sure you'll get tired of listening to me drone on for 20 minutes anyway. As I think you know, we're in the first year of a 2-year session. So the policy committees have finished on the first House bills. You've probably read stories at various points about, oh my God, suspense, the suspense file, all the bills are going to be killed. Well, that actually happens this week. The Appropriations Committee will lift, or I should say, excuse me, release bills, excuse me, from the suspense file later this week. We do expect, contrary to recent years when the state has been relatively flush, that there will be more bills held because of expense. New programs are unlikely to make it all the way through this year unless there's a ready source of money. So as I said, that releases Thursday, the House of Origin deadline. So all the Senate bills have to be voted to the Assembly by Friday, June 2nd. Same thing for the Assembly bills. And as you might imagine, the respective houses are nicer to the bills that are written by the members of their own house. So senators generally tend to be more generous with Senate bills, and Assembly members are more generous with Assembly bills. And the real fun is when everything switch houses, which is what we'll be working on June and July. The other big thing, and really top of mind, is the budget this year. As you may know, Governor Newsom released the May revise of his January budget on Friday. The really important piece is now he's anticipating a $31.5 billion shortfall. In January, it was $22.5 billion. The Legislative Analyst's Office has said that that $31.5 billion shortfall is quote unquote optimistic. So they think the budget situation will actually end up being much worse. Because of that budget shortfall, the governor shifted an additional $1.1 billion in reductions to the Resources Agency budget to a quote unquote climate bond, which he's provided no specifics in, and which is up in the air. That includes $50 million in dam safety and flood management, $60 million for the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and $270 million in water recycling. I'll talk a little bit more about the bonds that are circulating already in the legislature. The governor did maintain $8.5 billion in water spending through the already approved climate resilience investments. As you may know, the last couple of years, the governor has moved to sort of multi-year budgeting, which is both good and bad. It allows them to talk about how many billions and billions of dollars they're spending, but it makes actually tracking year-to-year expenses, unless you're really deep in the gory guts of the budget, more difficult. He did also in the May revised talk about increases for flood. Obviously, some of the atmospheric rivers hit end of December, beginning of January. The devastation that followed from that was unknown when he was preparing the January budget. In there, he had eliminated $40 million for the San Joaquin floodplain restoration, which was restored in the May revise. He's also set aside an additional $125 million for flood contingency set aside, $75 million for local flood control projects, such as down in Pajaro, $25 million to expand existing small business drought relief grant programs, and another $25 million for potential disaster relief where somebody isn't covered by FEMA. Part of that is from moving funds that were previously appropriated for drought over to flood. I guess if it's one thing, it's the other here in California. The governor also, because this has been a theme, talked a little bit about permit streamlining. There is a flood infrastructure related permit streamlining trailer bill that was recently released. There have been early concerns flagged by a number of folks, but I would imagine we'll see something like that move, if not in June, by the end of the session in September. If you're interested, CAL FIRE, wildfire has certainly been a concern the last few years, has maintained most of its budget, and where we've really seen significant whacks at the CNRA budget has really been in some of the coastal resilience programs, who have lost almost half of what they were projected to receive, going from a year where we had a significant budget to outlook that's pretty poor, at least for general fund revenues going forward. Moving on to specific bills, our jurisdiction includes the coast and also BCDC, which I'm sure you in the East Bay are familiar with. It's one of the really important bills there is SB 272 by Senator John Laird. There it's really trying to provide incentives for local jurisdictions to incorporate sea level rise planning into their local efforts. Where it's under the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission, it'd be through the local control program or through the similar program that BCDC runs for San Francisco Bay. Instead of using sticks, this is really bill intends to provide incentives so that jurisdictions that do the work earlier rather than later will be eligible for more funding than those jurisdictions that don't. I thought I would just mention, and some of you may be aware of this, I know we just saw the A's announce that they were moving to Las Vegas or potentially moving to Las Vegas. There was a host of legislation related to BCDC to facilitate the potential or lay the groundwork for that to happen, for the A's baseball park to be built at Howard Terminal. And we are again trying again in San Francisco to provide a state framework for the potential development of Pier 30 and 32, which is that big parking lot if you're coming into San Francisco from the East Bay, off to the left, that juts out over the bay. There again, it's just trying to figure out how to bring in private money to fund the sort of upgrades that the Embarcadero needs to do to have the waterfront prepared for sea level rise, which obviously, of course, will impact San Francisco Bay. That's SB 273 by Senator Wiener. Moving on to the assembly bills, one of the things, and some of you I'm sure are familiar with this, there's a lot of talk of carbon sequestration by natural and working lands, and one of the areas that's of most interest right now is the potential for quote unquote blue carbon. So planting kelp or restoring coastal wetlands and their potential to help sequester carbon naturally. So Assemblymember Borner-Horvath has AB 45, which would authorize the Coastal Commission to authorize blue carbon demonstration projects. Assemblymember Addis has AP 1407, which also seeks to facilitate coastal restoration with numerical targets for the restoration of kelp off the coast of California, eelgrass, and oyster beds. You may well be aware that the sort of warm blob that the state experienced offshore a few years ago led to indirectly to the death of sea stars, which led to an explosion of purple urchin populations, which have eaten all the kelp off the coast, which is why we've had in some parts off the North Coast in particular, 95% of the kelp is gone. And so there's obviously that severely disrupts the local ecosystem, is bad for the urchin fishery, actually, as a matter of fact. And there's significant efforts underway to try and figure out how to restore that. Assemblymember Davies has also AB 966, which seeks to address shoreline erosion and beach replenishment, and just trying to evaluate whether or not these programs work. I mean, it is one way to seek to address sea level rise, but what you run into, and I think this has happened down by San Diego in particular, you can spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on sand replenishment, and then a storm comes and most of your sand is gone. And so really trying to understand the bang for the buck there. One of the, moving on a little bit to offshore wind, I'm sure Laura is going to talk more about the energy aspects of offshore wind, which has been an important topic the last couple of years. But one issue where a committee like us has jurisdiction is because the Coastal Commission is going to actually end up being very important to offshore wind. We do expect that if we do have this 30 gigawatt build out offshore, it'll be mostly off the North Coast and mostly in federal waters. And actually the California Coastal Commission does have some jurisdiction in federal waters. So they'll have an important role there to try and address some of the mitigation that'll be necessary. SB 286 by Senator McGuire actually seeks to specifically address the potential loss of commercial fishing grounds from offshore wind. There's also additional bills by Assemblymember Zabur, AB 3, and AB 80, again by Assemblymember Addis, that seek to do some more work to try to understand the impacts offshore wind will have on the coastal environment. Moving on to conservancies and state parks, probably the biggest deal that we're seeing is Senator Padilla has SB 583 to establish a Salton Sea Conservancy. I'm sure you may be familiar with some of the tremendous challenges addressing the Salton Sea from the loss of agricultural runoff, which depending on what happens on the Colorado River over the next 6 to 9 months, maybe even worse. And so there is hope that actually having an on-the-ground state conservancy may help to focus state efforts there. There are also continuing efforts in a variety of bills really geared towards promoting outdoor access to state parks, which has been important and something people have been pushing at for a little while. There's a bill also, AB 833 by Assemblymember Luz Rivas to expand one of the parks in downtown Los Angeles. We do also expect that there is funding, and it's in the budget, for a new state park, Dos Rios, in the Central Valley, and purchasing that from River Partners, a nonprofit. I believe that's currently operating it. Moving on to oil and gas. As I think you know, on the 2024 November ballot, there will be a referendum on a bill that passed last year, SB 1137, that was by Senator Gonzalez, and it was part of the governor's climate package, which ended up being 7 or 8 bills at the end of last session that he sort of announced were important to him 2 weeks to go, and mad rush, and almost all of them actually ended up passing. But SB 1137 would create a health protection zone of 3,200 feet around oil facilities or oil wells, and require enhanced monitoring for those facilities if they're existing already, and then actually ban new ones within 3,200 feet of a home or any place that's likely to be occupied. And you can appreciate why that bill is controversial, and it will be on the ballot in November. There's another bill also by Senator Gonzalez that seeks to establish liability for the operator of an oil and gas facility that where someone resides within 3,200 feet of that if they come down with certain illnesses. That's a very controversial bill. We'll see what happens. And then Assembly Member Wendy Carrillo has AB 1167, which would require individual bonds and instead of the use of blanket bonds for all transferred wells and oil facilities. As I think you know, orphan wells and deserted facilities have been a big problem in the oil industry. The oil here in California is been produced for well over 100 years. Our fields are old. They're mostly, not entirely, small producers. And so there is considerable concern that a bill like Assembly Member Carrillo's could have a strong negative impact. People will declare bankruptcy and walk away instead of keeping existing facilities in operation. Moving on to wildfire, probably the most interesting bill from our perspective at SB 310 by Senator Dodd. The reason it's interesting is because it allows the CNRA Secretary Crowfoot to negotiate with individual federally recognized California Native American tribes to provide waivers for certain permits that are currently required for them to conduct cultural burns. This bill is also very controversial, but there is a strong push within the fire prevention community to both promote prescribed fire and also cultural burning. There's been a lot of legislative changes to law the last couple of years seeking to promote prescribed fire and cultural burning, and so we'll see if the next step is taken. There are certainly some concerns, and we'll see what happens. Certainly with, as I think you may know, most of the administration's efforts have been focused in the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force to seek to address the quote unquote wildfire emergency, to really focus efforts on fire prevention treatments to forests. And so there's efforts underway to provide more oversight of that. In the water world, which I'm sure is of interest to all of you, there have been bills introduced to really seek to address some of the things that occurred last year, where there were blatant violations of certain laws because it was worth it. By the time the fine could even be assessed, the water that had been illegally diverted had done what the diverters did, and the fine was pretty nominal. But also an appellate court decision last year. There's also legislation introduced to address that. Many of these bills are really still geared at addressing some of the issues that came up with respect to drought. Obviously, there's been a shift in thinking a little bit more about flood, although certainly through some of the research that's been going on, like with Arc Storm, for example, about some of the potentially catastrophic flooding that California faces, has certainly garnered a lot of attention too. So one bill I'd like to flag for you is SB 389 by Senator Ben Allen. This would allow the State Water Board to investigate and document pre-1914 water rights. This bill was very controversial, barely made it out of our committee, but there is certainly concern that's been flagged, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, about sort of the lack of information that is available, particularly on the pre-1914 rights. Certainly also Assembly Member Bauer Kahan, who's the chair of Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife, who has also jurisdiction over water supply. She has a bill, AB 460, that seeks to authorize the Water Board to get interim relief to enforce water rights and related issues, and also to increase the penalties. This is bill is a direct response, as I mentioned before, to what happened up in Shasta over the summer. Senator Dodd also has a bill related to collecting more data on water. I think what happens, and I know all of you are probably better aware of this than I am, is that when we get into a drought and there's questions about suspending people's abilities to divert, the question becomes, well, who is diverting? And we really still, I mean, it's always incredible to me when I'm reminded of this, don't necessarily, at least from the regulatory level, have all the information that we need to regulate appropriately. So we'll see what happens. I expect that there will be controversy about that from the rest of the legislative session. And then just finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the climate bonds. I introduced them a little bit earlier. Because of the budget cuts, or the budget shortfalls, I should say, that we've been facing, there's been a lot of discussion that has gotten quickened, I suppose I should say, in the last 6 months, since it became clear that there would be cuts to the climate-related resiliency projected budgets because of the budget shortfall. Of course, the advocates have asked for a lot and are still asking for a lot, but I would say that the two bills I'd like to flag in particular are AB 1567 by Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, which is a $15.1 billion climate resiliency bond, and SB 867 by Senator Allen, which is a $15.5 billion bond. Senator Eggman also has SB 638, which is $6 billion bond, really targeted at dam safety, flooding. The recent report by the Central Valley Board on some of the needs there to address flooding. We're really at the beginning of the bond discussion. I think there will be elements of the bond that go from climate resilience to wildfire and fire prevention, forestry management, to clean energy, potentially, to habitat restoration, to addressing dam safety, addressing levees and other infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. The real question with the bonds and when the discussions will really get going will really depend on what ballot they end up on, should one make it all the way through. If it's going to be on a March 2024 ballot, so the primary ballot, it's quite likely that the bond discussion will have to be completed this year by September when the legislature adjourns. If, on the other hand, the bond goes on the November 2024 ballot, which would likely have greater turnout, but would have a lot of other stuff, including obviously the presidential election, then the bond discussion really won't be finalized till May or June of next year. Certainly the governor has signaled his willingness to be interested in a bond. So the likelihood that there will be some agreement reached through negotiation between the two houses and the governor, and increases the likelihood that there will be a bond, but the total amount of it and what exactly is in it remains to be seen. As I think, as I was, certainly shocked when they were talking about a $15 billion bond. It's likely that, particularly in November 2024, there will be other bonds on the ballot as well for both schools and also mental health. So it's really not, all of that has to be taken into consideration, I think, before any of the language for any of that is finalized. So stay tuned. I would certainly encourage you, to the extent that you have an advocacy arm, if there is something that you're seeking, to talk to your state senator or talk to your assembly member, and push on them to push on the folks that are drafting the bond. I have been told, for what it's worth, that the preliminary polling on a large bond has been positive. And I don't believe the polling for which ballot it should go on has been conducted yet. And then finally, just to talk about a little bit about where our committee is going. Oversight has certainly been something that Pro Tem has really wanted to emphasize this year. We've had oversight hearings already on the administration's 30 by 30 plan. And 30 by 30 is the goal of protecting 30% of the state's coastal waters and lands by 2030 in an effort to stave off sort of the sixth mass extinction that we're in the middle of, and because California is a biodiversity hotspot for a variety of reasons, this Mediterranean climate that we love so much. We've also had an oversight hearing on wildfire. I do expect over the next year that we'll have oversight hearings on certainly the state's oil and gas regulator and on DWR, in particular on water infrastructure. But as always, TBD. We're still relatively early in the legislative year. And I think that's all I had prepared. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Catherine. I feel like you covered so much. It was a lot to take in, and I really appreciated that. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Show us your notes. I'm not seeing any raised hands at the moment. I'll just give everyone another second, and nobody put any questions in the chat. So I guess you covered everything we could possibly want to know. Katharine, I do have a quick question. I'm curious if you could speak just from your years of experience in this. Like, what have you generally seen in regards to all of these different proposals for bonds? How do they usually come together into one thing that makes itself on the ballot? Can you speak a little bit to that process?
Well, just again, to be clear, this is from my perspective.
Yes, of course.
I would say a bond requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature. While we do have super majorities for the Democratic Party, that does not mean that any 2/3 vote is automatic. And so the good news is that the governor has shown that he is interested in a bond. So the likelihood if a bond is passed that the governor will sign it is increasing. I think it will take a lot of negotiation to get to the finish line. I think we're really at the beginning. As far as I've seen, there seems to be a presumption that it'll be on the November ballot, November 2024 ballot, which means that we really won't start really getting all the kinks worked out and all the pieces put together probably until next spring, early summer. But I would certainly encourage you again that if your agency or organization has a project that would fit into one of the different categories, that again is capital infrastructure, because not everything, of course, is appropriate to be paid for by bond, that you talk to your state senator or state assembly member and have them make an ask. You know, you never really know how things are going to play out. And I should say the other complicating factor is we are anticipating a leadership change in the assembly in about a month after the budget is signed. The budget's due on June 15th. And that will potentially change a lot of you know, who's even negotiating on behalf of the speaker. I mean, it's all up in the air, so we don't really know yet. So I'm not really doing a good job of answering your question. I apologize, but it's, you know, it doesn't hurt to just, if you've got something that, you know, is suitable, to ask early and keep asking. That isn't to say that last minute things don't make it in, because they do, but it's just easier. I guess I say this from a staff perspective, it's easier on me. But you know, it's just balancing the priorities of the different members of the legislature who respond to their constituents and advocates, to try and do the best they can.
That's helpful. Thank you. It looks like Daniel has raised his hand. Daniel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you. This is great. Which is to say, Katharine, your presentation is incredibly thorough. Yeah. So just quick comment. You know, we all know that the budget is a reflection of our priorities. So it's kind of disheartening to see that for the governor, his priority is not natural resources, which is getting like a 50% cut. You know, and I know it's complicated. But moreover, he's doing it in such a way where his priority seems to be to ensure that all of the overworked advocates and conservation people spend their time negotiating with each other rather than doing, you know, moving things forward. So that's my comment. My question is, you know, another thing. Well, you know, people, we need to talk, right? We all need to talk about what's going on. But my question is, kind of around deeper legislative stuff. We've seen a bunch of stuff with the governor recently where he proposes, you know, an end run around California Endangered Species Act for Joshua Tree, and he wraps that up in a package that gives the administration somewhat unlimited authority to do that end run, you know, do what they want, and then also do it for any other species that are endangered due to climate change. We see, and he does this not through the policy process, but through trailer bills, budget trailer bills. So it doesn't get any kind of public debate, or not what it deserves. Similarly, you know, the idea of these trigger cuts, where the governor puts out, you know, he's going to cut natural resources. Well, you know, the trigger cut is basically where he proposes a big cut, but then says that the funding the administration has the option of restoring that funding should money become available in the future. Basically, taking over the legislature's primary authority of the purse. And we see this over and over. You know, I can do a long list, but you don't want to hear it. I'm just wondering if there's a perception, if folks within the legislature are realizing that this is a pattern and that there's a need to think about it and potentially push back against the pattern rather than just individual instances.
Well, first off, I would say that, and again, just to be clear, this is just my personal opinion. I think many of the elected members of the legislature in both houses are very much in pro-climate, pro-addressing climate change. I think there's a lot of support for that. But when it comes down to who's the champion of the bumblebees, who were recently covered under CISA, the California Endangered Species Act, or the Joshua Tree, it becomes less clear. I think specifically on the Western Joshua Tree, there is a policy bill, so something that would be similar, but not undercut the California Endangered Species Act, but would provide similar protections to the Joshua Tree, that is moving through the policy process. Obviously, the governor does everything he can to get his way and go around the legislature. And there's certainly a role for trailer bills in that. I mean, I think the energy trailer bill last year, the first one, was breathtaking in some of the language that was in there. But the flip side is the legislature passed it. So until the legislature says no, and I think certainly on the trigger cuts, there is certainly going to be or the trigger restoration of cuts. Certainly the legislative analyst's office has been pretty explicit in their opposition to that. But it is up to the legislature to say no, and I think they've said no to some things, but said yes to other things. Certainly the governor is been blessed with a booming economy for much of his tenure, and was able to give money away on all kinds of stuff and fund everyone's priorities. But traditionally, when the budget has shortfalls, the first agencies to lose funding are, for example, and I say this because I covered them, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I think, there's certainly been an effort under Governor Brown to make sure that there are special funds, so not general fund, which is, income taxes, to have special funds pay for the agency's work, which is awesome. But, certainly the Department of Fish and Wildlife, leaving aside its commercial fishing program and its hunting program, and some of the work it does on timber harvest plans, for example, does have this public trust obligation as a trustee of the state's wildlife and wild lands in part. And general fund should pay for that. But there's certainly, when there isn't enough general fund, a lot of competing uses for that. And so it's really, I certainly don't envy the governor or his team in the Department of Finance, or certainly my colleagues, on the Senate budget or Assembly budget team, because it's how you express your priority for things is how you spend money on them, and it's just hard. But I do think certainly the governor likes to have his cake and eat it too. But the legislators has generally voted for a lot of the things that the governor has put as his priorities. So, I mean, the other thing is really the advocacy organizations. Your point is well taken, that they spend a lot of time talking to each other, but it's really also pushing back on the Newsom administration is really important. I know that there are many members of the legislature who, when they're seeking to figure out how to vote one way or the other, look to some of the advocacy organizations for what they recommend. And if people aren't saying oppose it, it's not going to happen. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but
It was
I hope that made sense.
And thank you for the question, Daniel. I don't know that we have any other questions for you, Katharine, and I want to just give everyone another second, just in case anyone had a last-minute addition. But it sounds like definitely some thought needs to be put into reaching out to our local electeds and thinking through kind of what requests might look like should these bonds make their way to the ballot. And thank you for the attention to some of the bills. We'll certainly put those on our tracking list and engage with them. As you probably are familiar, Rebecca Bauer-Cahan is a local elected here. So her bill in particular is something that has definitely come to our attention, and we've talked a little bit with her about it. So Thank you for being here and presenting to us today. It was really a pleasure to have you, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to help to educate us on these issues. So thank you for being here. Our next speaker is actually Lori, and I think she just joined us. So we're kind of jumping from one to the other. Lori, are you there?
Hi,
there we
Laura.
go. Oh, I'm sorry, Laura. I'm having a thing with names this morning. Sorry about that, Laura. Laura, how do you pronounce your last name? I don't want to.
Shybut.
Shybut. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for being here, Laura. It's wonderful to have you, and I appreciate you kind of jumping in kind of midway through as we're having two different speakers this morning, which means I'm going to do a quick introduction of you. I hope that that's all right. Laura is the Deputy Chief Consultant for the Assembly Committee on Utilities and Energy. This is a group, Laura, just so you kind of have some context, this is a group that traditionally talked a lot about water and environment issues, and we've recently included energy as part of that. And so we're really excited to have you here and help to educate us a little bit on some of those issues. In regards to Laura, prior to her role in the committee, she was the Chief of Staff to State Senator Jerry Hill, representing the Senate District 13 in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. So probably very aware of Bay Area issues. She also served as a consultant to the Subcommittee on Gas, Electric, and Transportation Safety, where she held various informational hearings and ran legislation advancing gas and electric infrastructure safety, hugely important issues. She was a Science and Technology Science Policy Fellow, placed with the Assembly Committee on Utilities and Energy under Chairman Chris Holden. She has a doctorate and master's in chemistry from the University of Oregon, go Ducks, where she researched how gases interacted with liquids at industrial and atmospheric surfaces. So again, I am always amazed and impressed by the incredible depth of knowledge the consultants for both our Assembly and our Senate committees have. So often you all are such experts in your field. So it's really a pleasure to have you here and a pleasure to have you as part of our state. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving us a little bit of information about yourself, anything I may have missed, and then please feel free to dive in and tell us what we need to be paying attention to this year.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you for having me, and glad to be a part of this discussion, and appreciate the opportunity to hop on midway through, although I'm kind of sad that I missed Katharine's presentation. I always learn a lot from her. And I don't know if she shared, but she was also a science fellow prior. So it's a nice network that we have within the Capitol of bringing scientists into the legislature. Yeah, I mean, I would say to sort of harken back to my work in Senator Hill's office, a lot of the focus that we have within the Energy Committee follows three different buckets. So one being infrastructure safety, the other being reliability, and the final sort of stool of our sort of energy portfolio is affordability, and how all of those sort of sync together, especially in light of this climate transition that we're undergoing within the energy space. And so I think for the last 5, maybe even 10 years, going back to the San Bruno gas pipeline explosion, a lot of the emphasis on energy legislation has been around infrastructure safety, especially with the wildfires and all of that work that has happened. And the committee did start off this year with one informational hearing talking about that, mostly around the atmospheric river events that have been happening and sort of the impacts of climate to our energy infrastructure and how to add resiliency to that. But I would say a lot of the conversation within the legislature around energy has moved away from safety over the last 2 years, and it's been more of a, or even 3 years, I should say, and it's been more of a focus on reliability. Given how much incremental resources we have on the grid, and then the extreme heat events that we've been experiencing each summer, there's been an enormous effort, and this is top of mind for me because we have an informational hearing today on reliability, especially summer readiness. And I think the CAISO is actually putting out their summer readiness plan today, is what I've heard. So a lot of focus on system reliability, what that means, how to shore it up, how to be prepared, and then how to do it in an affordable, again, going back to sort of those 3 pillars, in an affordable and even clean way. A lot of our reliability measures over the last 3 years have been pretty dirty generation. So there was the establishment of a strategic reserve through the last year budget cycle, which is mostly diesel and natural gas power that is called up during extraordinary events like a Western-wide heat wave. And so there's a lot of interest within the legislature to look at this, try to figure out how to ensure reliability as we make this transition. We've also had many hearings over the last 5 years on affordability and many bills that raise this question. I think the most top of mind and topical at the beginning of this year had to deal with natural gas prices because of the massive spikes that were experienced across the state in the winter, starting around December in Southern California and persisting into February into the northern part of the state. I mean, some people were paying triple, quadruple the amount that they were expecting to pay for the same amount of usage. And so really trying to understand what's going on with bill impacts, especially in light of all of the electrification goals that we have. So if our energy bills keep increasing, how is that actually going to incentivize customers to transition to more electricity usage? And then the final piece that have been a large topic of conversation is infrastructure. So previously it had been about safety, but now the focus is like, how do we build enough infrastructure to meet our goals? And that's sort of overlaid with transmission development and certain delays and how it takes 10+ years to build a transmission line within the state. And also a lot of focus on distribution level infrastructure and customer energization or interconnection that takes way longer than anyone was expecting. And maybe y'all can share some stories if you're familiar with problems in your area, because we've been hearing throughout the state on how hospitals are given energization timelines of 5 to 10 years, even though they were expecting to get service within 6 months, and their businesses and development, and how the delays in getting onto the electricity grid can impact the economy at a larger scale. So we're actually having a hearing next week on distribution infrastructure planning and trying to figure out where the friction points are to try to smooth them out as we anticipate more and more need for that infrastructure into the future. So that sort of covers a lot of the perspective that we've been focusing on in the recent years within the committee. I would say some of the other pieces are around like the massive investment that has come from the federal government through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. How do we leverage state opportunities to get more of those funds into California? And particularly with a focus on offshore wind of recent, that goes back to sort of the infrastructure question as well. There was a very large summit over the last 2 weeks talking about offshore wind and how to get the development cycle moving there, because it has so many different levels of bureaucratic oversight to get one project permitted. And as far as the big bills are concerned within the committee this year, there's been a handful. One was sort of a thematic approach from multiple members on different bills around interconnection issues, largely spurred by different delays within their individual districts. And then there's been a whole conversation about regionalizing the independent system operator. So the independent nonprofit that sort of acts as the traffic cop to our electricity grid. They don't own the infrastructure, they just allow the electrons to flow and manage the operation of that. It's currently constrained to the boundaries of California with some pieces of Nevada included. And there's been probably a 5 to 7 year conversation about what that would look like if it became a Western-wide entity. And so that was a very heated debate in our committee, and that bill is currently in appropriations because it has all of these implications on what it means for our clean energy policies if it does expand. It could help us enormously with reliability, but what does it mean once we start getting into federal issues and the state doesn't have as much control over our policies anymore, theoretically? There's a lot of uncertainty. And then I also don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about one aspect of this year that dominated the early part of this year and now has sort of been resolved is the oil and gas special session that came through. So a lot of my work has been focused on electricity and natural gas infrastructure and planning. But given sort of the high gasoline prices that were experienced last year, the governor called a special session, and it was the Energy Committee that in both the Senate and the Assembly that dealt with legislation related to that. And that all sort of wrapped up in the special session, wrapped up at the early part of this year, but now we're starting to see implementation go forward at the regulatory agencies, mostly the Energy Commission. So we're paying attention to what that looks like. There's some code cleanup that's coming through in the most recent budget cycle. So it's not fully completed, even though the special session has concluded. But again, that harkens back to the affordability aspect of what energy looks like moving forward. I feel like I talked a lot about all sorts of things that I'm dealing with. We have a lot going on because it's an exciting time to be in the energy space. It's just we're asking a lot from our utilities and customers as we try to move off of fossil generation into a cleaner space and all the new technology that comes with it. And then the understandable sort of friction points that come with that as well. But it's very exciting. We have a lot going on, but I would certainly welcome thoughts and feedback on any of this.
Well, thank you, Laura. And again, thank you for being here. I'm just going to open it up to the group just to see if there's any questions here or any comments folks want to make or conversations they'd like to start with Laura. Feel free to raise your hand or put questions in the chat.
Hey, Laura, thanks for being on. Bob Brown here with WSPA, West Space Petroleum Association. With the, you're right, a lot of work's underway at the Energy Commission. How much is the legislature paying attention to that versus everything else that's going on?
I mean, it's hard, right, to balance when we have so many bills coming through. And, May Revise just happened last Friday. Right. But we're committed to paying attention to it. And it's helpful because the administration proposed some cleanup to the Skinner bill in the May Revise, which right. pulls it back into the conversation here as well. So I would say it's not forgotten. We're paying close attention, and the stakeholders aren't letting us ignore it either.
Yeah, because it's getting a lot of, the CEC has a lot to do.
Yes.
By virtue of those bills that were signed, or the bill that was signed. So what was the budget? Was it 7 million, I think, that was allocated, or did I get that right?
Yeah. You mean in the recent proposal? Yeah. I can't remember the number for the BCP. But they're asking for 14 positions. That's what I recall. Okay. And there's also a trailer bill for cleanup on the measure, which I think is going to involve more conversation than just the simple cleanup that the administration put forward. So yeah, there's going to be one conversation around funding for the oil and gas work at the Energy Commission, and then another separate conversation on what additionality needs to happen to the Skinner bill that we didn't have time for during the process when it went through extraordinary. So I imagine I'm going to hear from a lot of folks on cleanup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll be
and the other sticky piece about the proposal to fund the Energy Commission staff is that they're seeking electricity ratepayers to fund that. And so I think it's going to be how do I put it kindly, a topic of discussion on whether or not that's appropriate, right? So we'll see how that shakes out as well.
Very diplomatic, thank you.
Of course. And I do see there's a question in the chat about Diablo Canyon. Let me just take a moment to read it really fast. Yeah, what are the plans to replace? It's asking about the extension of Diablo, and then what are the plans to replace that capacity if in fact Diablo Canyon is closed. So that was one of the main, and thank you, Bob, for that question. That was one of the main big pieces of energy legislation that went through at the end of last session, again, under the sort of guise of reliability, was a proposal to extend the life of Diablo Canyon, which is currently scheduled to retire one of the units in 2024 and the second unit in 2025. And so the legislation pushed that to 2030 to sort of get us over our midterm reliability hump in some ways. That process is still going on, so it's not guaranteed, even though we passed the legislation to authorize it. The CPUC has opened a proceeding to enable it to be extended, but there's also a federal component to this. So PG&E has filed an application with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that initially got denied for various reasons, and then they're seeking to refile and have gotten signals that if they do, it will move forward appropriately. And so if all of that authorization goes through, then it will be extended into 2030. But the big question is, what does our reliability mix look like if Diablo goes down, either in 2025 or 2030? And when the CPUC had originally scheduled for it to retire by 2025, they had made a requirement that all of these additional resources that would come online to backfill the 2+ gigawatt loss of Diablo would be from clean energy resources, and they have a certain definition for how they do that. But there's been supply chain issues, there's been project delays, there's been permitting delays. The pandemic has not seen a lot of those resources come online in time. And that was one of the motivations for why they sought to extend it last year. And as part of that negotiation, the legislature wanted to ensure that by 2030, it's not the same story coming back to us, where project delays and timing issues and things, there aren't resources available to actually replace Diablo. And so as part of that bill that got signed, it was a requirement that the planning agencies at the CEC, the CPUC, and CAISO had to treat the Diablo Canyon facility as if it were going offline by 2025, so that the utilities would go ahead and start doing forward procurement of resources to cover it, even though it's going to be extended, presumably until 2030. Hopefully that answered your question. But that's still ongoing. It hasn't fully been determined, and there's a lot of work to do between now and 2030 to ensure that that will happen. Jared, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Along those lines, to hit the clean energy goals, as well as electrifying the transportation sector in the state, the CEC reports that we need 6 gigawatts of new clean energy each year between now and 2050.
Yes.
We are not hitting those at all, right? You're talking about a major plant coming offline, but you've got CEQA lawsuits against renewable energy projects. You have commercial solar just tanked through the new CPUC regulations. How do you see us actually getting there, and what can the state do to fast track permitting to encourage that growth? I'm just curious to get your take.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a lot of effort as well. And that thing I haven't, so to go back to your original premise, 6 gigawatts per year is insane. And we haven't met that level of build out in the decades that they've been working on renewable energy policy, right? So it's asking for a monumental level of coordination and effort across the board. That said, right, just within the CAISO balancing authority last year, there was 4 gigawatts of batteries that were installed to try to meet a reliability need. So it's not that building isn't happening. It's just for some resource types, it's becoming more difficult. And the more we build, the more we start to get into land use challenges, difficulties with like all of the low-hanging fruit has been plucked in some ways. And so it's starting to get more difficult. So putting that on the table. But I would say the legislature has been very keenly tuned into this issue. There was a part of the budget last year that is seeking to streamline permitting reform by taking some aspects of it not away from local governments, but providing a secondary pathway for some renewable projects to go through the CEC rather than local government permitting, which the CEC has that for thermal generation, so like natural gas plants, but allowing them to do that for solar and wind facilities. And there's actually a wind project up in Shasta that was originally denied by the county that has now applied through the CEC to do that fast track process. But I think there's also streamlined judicial review as part of that through CEQA. A large conversation this year, and I believe the governor teed this up in his May revise presentation last week, but I haven't actually seen either a BCP. I haven't seen any documentation on what it exactly is going to look like, but he teed up the notion of more streamlined CEQA review for transmission infrastructure as well. And what that looks like. Laura Friedman, a Southern California member of the Assembly, has a bill to also try to streamline or even just exempt a lot of energy projects from the CEQA process. And during last year's budget negotiations, there was also language for transmission projects that have gone through the ISO process that they didn't need to go through a secondary process at the CPUC, because currently there has to be like multiple levels of showing of need for each project, and it felt like a redundancy. So we've been trying to smooth out some of these bumps along the way. Yeah, it's not done by any means. It feels like, you know how in Washington they talk about infrastructure week, or maybe a couple of weeks. It feels like the last 3 years in the legislature have been just about infrastructure within the energy space on how to get it built faster. And the 6 gigawatt per year target for resources alone is ambitious, but thinking about all the associated infrastructure to connect those resources to just makes it an even more monumental task. I say all that though, and I still somehow remain hopeful and positive that we're going to move in that direction. I think there's been massive effort from the utilities and other stakeholders to really make these clean energy goals be met. And the thing I also keep in mind is, what was it, 5-10 years ago, there were headlines across the state about how we've over procured and we're curtailing solar and it's a waste of ratepayer dollars and we need to slow down our procurement. And so it also is sort of responsive of these boom and bust cycles that sometimes, you know, get spun up. And so now we're in this process where we're like, oh, we weren't procuring appropriately. How do we align our planning? And then how do we streamline all of our processes to meet this massive moment? So there's a lot of attention on it. Is the work done? No, but we're very keen on it.
Thank you for these questions and discussion, everyone. Laura, I will add to the conversation a little, just curious about whether you can give us some background on the legislation that, and let me back up a little bit. There's been a lot of attention, I feel like, in the media, this idea that folks' PG&E bills, and we're PG&E here in the Bay Area, are going to shift or change because there's now going to be kind of a line item on their bill that has to do with infrastructure capital costs that just has to do with their income, right? Or that cost is based on income. And there's a lot of attention that's been given to that. And a lot of our energy partners have sort of said, hey, you know, this is in reaction to a bill. Can you give us any background on that, or how you see that kind of playing out going forward? I know it's no longer sitting with the legislator, but I'm curious if you could give us maybe some historical context or just let folks know a little bit about how that all came to be.
Yes, I mean, it's been a long conversation around affordability within the legislature and at the CPUC for years as a potential proposal. And I myself, I'm both a PG&E and a SMUD customer, PG&E for my gas service, SMUD for my electric. And SMUD has this fixed charge associated with it where I forget what it's either $25 or $30 per month that I have to pay regardless of my usage, right? To help cover infrastructure costs. And that has been a proposal at the CPUC for years. I think their sort of fixed charge that they allowed was $5 minimum or something. And so, yes, there was a budget as part of the budget package last year to try to address affordability. We passed the possibility of the CPUC raising that to be sort of income graduated and establishing a fixed charge across the IOUs. And the effort, and I need to go in and this is something I've tabled for the time being while I'm dealing with other matters, but I need to go in and look at what the utilities have filed. But it isn't a response of the utilities like pushing for this. There was legislation that was adopted to kickstart this process to ultimate what the budget item says is that it will result in lower bills for at least the low income brackets, right? And so the utilities have filed applications to try to like change their rate structure to address this. I haven't gone in to look at it, and I haven't looked at the calculations to see like how much it's going to lower low income customers by versus how much it's going to increase higher income customers by. But I think that's where a lot of the dialogue has been it's going to raise the higher income customer bills by a certain amount, or if you have solar and if you're on a NIM tariff, it's going to raise your bill by X amount potentially. But at the end of the day, it comes back to, I mean, this is the whole discussion around NIM reform too, on who's paying for infrastructure costs and how much is that shifting if we don't sort of find an equitable way to distribute those costs. That's what the fixed charge is trying to get to. Does that help address the question, Lindy?
It does, yeah. And I mostly just wanted to kind of get any thoughts you had and also contextualize, like, where did this come from? Because I think we're seeing a lot of, a lot of news around it. And sometimes these things happen somewhat quickly through things like budget trailer bills, which I think has been brought up here already. So I won't belabor that point. So Bob Whitley did ask in the chat, what state agency is responsible for adequate planning for electricity generating capacity?
So the majority of them go through the CPUC. So for most utilities, they file plans with the CPUC. It's probably 90% of the state electricity players. And then the CPUC has their own massive planning process called the Integrated Resources Plan. And they create a system-wide plan for what resources we need. And then the individual utilities sort of match their plans to the system plan, and where gaps are identified, then there's additional procurement that's added. All of that gets resolved, and then that giant resource plan gets sent to the independent system operator, and then they figure out what transmission lines we need to connect all these resources. But I should say that the foundation of that is work at the Energy Commission to determine what our electricity demand 10, 15 years out is going to look like to help with that resource planning process. So the primary agency that's responsible is the CPUC, but it integrates the work of all of the other energy entities to ensure sort of adequate planning. Secondarily to that, I don't want to be remiss and forget our muni friends. A lot of the work within the municipal utility space happens internally. And so they do their own planning processes. Some of them have to file integrated resource plans also, but those go through the Energy Commission, and it's mostly just to ensure compliance. It's less of figuring out how their system fits in with the broader system. So yes, for the majority of the state, it goes to the CPUC.
Thank you, Laura. I think that may be the last question, at least that we have on board. Does anyone else have any questions for Laura? And I apologize again for calling you Lori. That's my mom.
It's okay.
You're
totally fine.
I jingle them all together. But it was really wonderful to have you here. And again, this is somewhat of a new space for us. So I think it was exciting to get to hear what you've been working on for years. At the same time, I think that you're right. There's a lot of stakeholders who have a lot of questions about how a lot of these things are actually going to roll out and what that's going to look like. So, we are an area and a region that relies and has a strong relationship with energy producers. And it's going to be an ongoing conversation that's certainly very present here in our community. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. I hope we'll be able to have this opportunity perhaps again next year. And I hope everyone will kind of help me in kind of waving Laura goodbye and saying, Thank you for her being here. I hope that you all will join us next month in June for further conversations about water, energy, and the environment, and appreciate you taking part in the East Bay Leadership Council this morning. I will give you back your 15 minutes.